I'm Dan Linzer, the Dean of the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. For each of the previous 16 Leopold lectures, we have had Dick Leopold sitting over here, getting ready to ask tough questions, but tonight Dick is ill and not able to join us. So I'm sure you join me in wishing him a speedy recovery and a return for the 18th lecture, but we are filming this, and so Dick will get to watch this and make sure that you all ask tough questions after the talk. The lectureship was established in 1990 as a result of the generous donations of former undergraduate students who studied with Professor Leopold. And for more than 40 years, most of them at Northwestern, Dick was an inspiring and challenging teacher of those students. His famous seminar course trained many students in critical thinking about the complex issues of the United States diplomatic history, and his students capitalized on that training with success beyond Northwestern in many careers, including educators, writers, lawyers, and public officials. And it's a wonderful tribute to Dick and the impact that he's had on his students that so many of his alumni return to campus each year for this event. And as is the tradition, I would ask that the Leopold alumni rise and be recognized as students of Dick's. Now. And thanks to them for making this lectureship possible. In addition to supporting the lectureship, some 200 of Dick's former students also supported the creation of an endowed professorship in Dick's name. And just last month, we had a celebration in the adjacent room to recognize that we had reached the fundraising goal to establish a permanent chair. And Dick was able to attend that occasion, so it was a wonderful opportunity for his former students and Dick to get together, and Dick got the last word that evening in speaking to his students once again. And in a moment, I will call upon the holder of that permanent endowed chair, Mike Sherry, to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Leopold was the William Smith Mason Professor of History and now is the William Smith Mason Professor Emeritus of History. He graduated from Princeton University in 1933, and he received his doctorate in 1938 from Harvard University. After 11 years on the Harvard faculty and as a naval officer in Washington, D.C., Dick came to Northwestern in 1948. He retired from the faculty in 1980, but as his former students will attest, ever since he has stayed intellectually active and the leader of the large Leopold family of former students. Among his many honors, Professor Leopold was selected as a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, as a Northwestern University Presidential Fellow, as a Distinguished Teaching Award recipient from the college, and as president of the Organization of American Historians. Professor Leopold wrote numerous books and articles, including The Growth of American Foreign Policy, A History, Elihu Root and the Conservative Tradition, and Robert Dale Owen, A Biography. His scholarly contributions were recognized by the Organization of American Historians, which in 1982 established the biannual Richard W. Leopold Prize for a distinguished book by a government historian, and in 1992 gave Professor Leopold its Distinguished Service Award. In addition to his work within the university, Dick Leopold served on numerous government committees concerned with the preservation of historical data and on the conduct of foreign policy. Among those groups were the National Archives Advisory Council and committees within the Department of State, Navy, Army, and the Atomic Energy Commission. The Leopold Lectureship each year brings to campus individuals with special experience in public affairs to address the Northwestern University community in this forum, and also to meet with students in smaller classrooms during the day. And now to introduce this year's Leopold Lecture, I call upon the Richard Leopold Professor of History, Michael Sherry.
Thank you, Dean Windsor. It's an honor for me to be here to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Samantha Power, and a pleasure to see such a large and diverse crowd here once again in an era of lots of understandable complaints about how the Academy is separated off from the rest of the world. This occasion is one occasion that undercuts those complaints, as does very much tonight's speaker, who has won wide recognition and influence for her work. Professor Power moved to the United States from Ireland at age 9. She is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School. And in school, so my secret sources tell me, she was a very serious competitor in intramural sports like soccer and ultimate frisbee. She was the founding director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and she is currently a professor of human rights practice at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And while on leave recently, she was also, among other things, a foreign policy fellow in the office of Senator Barrack Obama. As a reporter, she has traveled widely in the genocide-devastated regions that she has written about, and she is, of course, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, a book whose title incorporates a phrase from the little-remembered Secretary of State, Warren Christopher. I can tell that name rang lots of bells in this crowd. In that book, she succeeded in telling a dauntingly huge and dismaying story in a transparent and compelling fashion. There's a lot more that I could say about Professor Power, but you've come here to hear her, not me. Professor Power will lecture on the subject, Iraq's Collateral Damage. Let's welcome her to the podium.
It's great to be here. Wonderful to see a terrific crowd, and very, very sorry that I didn't get to meet Professor Leopold. And want to continue the argument. I'm speaking to the camera now because he'll be seeing this in his. We will. I want to hear your questions. I want to be challenged by Leopold. I don't want. That was one of the reasons I took this this lectureship. Is I wanted to have the great maestro, the great chess player there to rip me to shreds. That's the fun of it. Okay, so. I want a long handwritten note to which I will respond by email. Anyway, it's great to be here. We had a great discussion at dinner at our table, and so I've gotten a little bit of a sense of where people are coming from, but I turn your mic up. We can't hear you. I can't do anything related to technology other than put the mic towards your mouth, because it's toward my mouth. I'm just tall. Any better? Yeah, woo. Well, I said really profound things about how we get out of Iraq, and it's unfortunate you didn't hear it. Sadly. I can never repeat myself. Okay, what I am talking about is Iraq's collateral damage, and some of you may have thought that that would be about literally collateral damage, which is, of course, a term that the military has been using for some time. It's part of calculations as to when you choose a target. You can always predict that it's going to do some portion of damage to facilities, to civilians, to whatever that's in the neighborhood of your particular target, and those harms are weighed against the good, the proportional good that the target will do. And of course, there are major debates that one can have about collateral damage as it's conceived and the harm that the collateral damage has done, whether those calculations are done in a truly proportional way, et cetera. But that's actually not what I'm going to talk about. We can talk about it certainly in questions. What I want to look at is Iraq's effect on American foreign policy more generally and the damage that it has done, and then perhaps talk, hopefully, a little more hopefully about how we can undo some of that damage, even apart from what we do in Iraq or out of Iraq. It's incredibly important that we learn not only about the sins of omission and commission that gave rise to the fiasco. I mean, I think now there's a relative consensus in this country that this war has done tremendous damage to America's standing, to American troops, to the region. But maybe we think a little bit too rarely, and I think especially in Democratic policy circles, about the damage Iraq has done to other foreign policy objectives. And I happen to believe, and I'd be prepared to defend this afterwards, but that this is actually going to go down as the greatest strategic blunder in the history of American foreign policy. I mean, well, unfortunately, I don't think it's sadly not clapworthy. I wish I had it was a little more clapworthy, but I mean, I say that because most people are saying it's a colossal strategic blunder. There's nothing original there, but you still hear since Vietnam or since, you know, Pearl Harbor, which was not exactly a strategic blunder, but a tactical blunder. But I think that when I go into the collateral damage, we'll start to see Iraq as part of a much larger story, and a very unfortunate story. So to tell the story of Iraq's collateral damage, I thought I would start by bringing us back to the pre-9/11 world, then discuss post-9/11, pre-Iraq, and then talk about the collateral damage itself and then how we undo some of that damage, again, even apart from how we figure out how to get out of Iraq. So the pre-9/11 world's a long time ago. It's those blissful, untended to 1990s in the post-Cold War world, where in this country the appetite for foreign policy plummeted. Come home, America, it's the economy, stupid. Republican Congress slashed foreign aid budgets. Democratic Party, perhaps you could say, didn't have much choice but to go along, but certainly in the executive branch you have a pulpit. Didn't really make a strong case for foreign policy. And whether one talks about the first year of the Bush administration or the tail end of the Clinton administration, of course, an inattention even to, or an insufficient degree of attention even to al-Qaeda and its rise. I mean, the turn-off from the world was relatively thorough. And whether you're talking about Rwanda or the steady stream of al-Qaeda attacks and the ever more sophisticated stream of al-Qaeda attacks, our emphasis as a country was elsewhere. If one had to sort of classify the doctrine that defined American foreign policy in the 1990s, up until I think the first year of the Bush administration, I would use the term mercantilist realism, and I don't exactly know what I mean, but the Tom Friedman theory that no two countries with a McDonald's in them had ever gone to war with one another became, I think, largely a substitute for foreign policy rather than a guide for it. There was a notion that democracy would spread on its own, even if you didn't buy the Frank Fukuyama theory of the end of history. There was a very, very strong sense that liberal democratic structures would spread naturally, even on their own, even without a nudge. The old saws of realism, of course, were very much at work in the way partnerships were chosen and defined. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. The old Cold War maxims didn't really disappear from foreign policy despite the advent of democratic administrations. People might remember the most favored nation trading status debate about China, or even debates about the Balkans and whether it mattered. National interest was defined in terms of national security and economic interests, and the Balkans came to matter when it became clear and America's standing was imperiled by its investment of prestige in the region and the insufficient return on that prestige. So we were at stake in a profound way, and that was especially true in Kosovo, having already gotten involved in Bosnia, again, I think largely because of the beating that NATO was taking by being at stake and by being unable to stop even tin pot dictators in southeastern Europe. If there was a theory with regard to international institutions that defined the Clinton administration, it was multilateral when we can, unilateral when we must. When you then turn to the Bush administration, it was unilateral when we can and multilateral only when we absolutely must. But when, again, I'm talking pre-9/11, one remembers the Bush administration's early stands on the International Criminal Court, on the Kyoto Protocol, and the loss of legitimacy, or the erosion of legitimacy by such frontal attacks on these treaties, which President Clinton himself showed very little affection for, but didn't declare any intention to eviscerate. I must say now, and I'll come to this, that I long for the legitimacy problems of Kyoto and the ICC. I wish those were the legitimacy problems we were still dealing with internationally. It's a very different matter entirely when one is talking about waterboarding and the Geneva Conventions and things that we've been actively, a participant to. One of the interesting phenomenons, I think, in the pre-9/11 world, but it hadn't really gained traction, but I think it was brewing out there, with regard to human rights, or specifically with regard to genocide. And I know there are a number of students here who are part of the Darfur movement here at Northwestern. I'm very grateful for the work that you all have done. But President Clinton did quite an interesting thing for all the kind of realist underpinnings of his, slightly more internationalist administration. He said publicly in 1998 that he was sorry about having been a bystander to the genocide in Rwanda. And I didn't happen to like his apology very much. I thought it was a little bit, I didn't inhale, I didn't have sexual relations with that woman kind of parsing, because what he said was, I didn't fully imagine the depth and the speed of the, I didn't fully appreciate the depth and the speed of the unimaginable horror which engulfed you. This is what he said to the Rwandans when he visited there, and actually never left the airport, but did issue that reckoning of sorts. And again, I picked it apart and lambasted it, and then I went to Rwanda a few months later, and they had, thinking he was going to leave the airport, they had repaved the road from the airport to the city, and they actually renamed that road, because they had done it for his visit, Clinton Boulevard. So much did it mean to them that an American president would come and would, reckon in any way with what had been done to them. And but more than the effect that it had on Rwandans, Clinton's apology, plus some of the writing Philip Gourevitch and others did, Hotel Rwanda and so on, that's actually more recent, that's after 9/11, but there was a brewing recognition among human rights-minded or anti-genocide-minded people in this country that if you wanted government to take account of these issues, despite all the talk of never again, it wasn't something governments were ever going to do naturally. That traditional focus on national security interests, economic interests, et cetera, those interests are defined very much or have been defined in the short term, the medium term at best. And genocide on its own was never really going to rank. But the one way you could conceivably get in and affect policy would be to affect domestic political interests. And so you started to see in the pre-9/11 world the kind of brewing of a constituency that came to believe that unless it made its voice heard and convinced presidents that actually there was a constituency out there that really cared about these things, that might even vote accordingly, that the government would predictably ignore these things unless that constituency made its voice heard. Okay, so that's just a very insufficient sketch of the pre-9/11 world. But now what about the post-9/11 world and the pre-Iraq world? Because I do want to talk about what Iraq has done to our standing. So suddenly with 9/11, we all remember, that terrible kind of naked, vulnerable feeling, and also the questions and the searching that went on in red states and blue states alike. The why do they hate us? Why do they want to kill us? and attention to foreign policy books and everything, suddenly became best-selling books. You used to be able to even find publishers for them in the trade press, and it was the flavor of the month. I mean, people wanted to look beyond the ocean that separates us from other continents and see what was going on, what they'd been missing. The foreign aid budgets were doubled in the Bush administration's first 2 years after 9/11. And very, very interestingly, those old saws of realism, actually, of the traditional Morgenthawian, Kissingerian realism, came under very substantial scrutiny in Washington. So that idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, well, for a while that was Saddam Hussein, of course. Saddam Hussein was the enemy of Iran, and he was deemed our friend. Well, that didn't seem to be working out terribly well. And when you partnered with undemocratic regimes like those in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, lo and behold, we learned from the hijackers themselves, all but 3 of whom were from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that the resentments vest toward the government that is repressive, but also toward governments that are backing the repressive regime. And so there's sort of seemingly in an era of asymmetric warfare, no such thing as a cost-free partnership. Couldn't be simply mercantilistic or simply about military bases if the citizens in these countries were looking beyond and actually had the tools, even without having a state behind them, to hurt us where it really, really mattered. Now, so I think you see that, of course, in President Bush's second inaugural. I mean, some of that is his own fervor and an idea of being uniquely placed and even divinely placed to be leading the world in a new way, and a kind of almost liberation theology. But some of it is rooted in a new realism. I mean, a sense of, okay, well, actually what goes on inside a state, realism in the realistic sense, not in the Kissingerian, Morgenthawian sense, but that what goes on inside a state is actually very relevant to our security, at least in the long term, and I think even in the medium term. Now, in the post 9/11 world, of course, we also had an instant infusion in the immediate post 9/11 world, an instant infusion of legitimacy. The French, Le Monde, we're all Americans now. Yasser Arafat going out of his way to give blood at the Red Cross for survivors of 9/11. And I think beyond what I've mentioned already, which is our governmental resource allocations that were new, and a new sense that you actually had to invest in failed states and think twice perhaps about these uncritical partnerships that we had with abusive states. This is all mainly in the realm of thinking. There was an enormous amount of allocation in the short time between 9/11 and what I'll come to, the war in Iraq. But there was, I think, among citizens, the possibility anyway for an adult conversation about how we deal with the central threats of the 21st century, most of which are transnational threats. I mean, when one looks at global warming, global disease, and terrorist networks, none of them are threats that can be handled by single countries. Even if you had all the commitment in the world and if everybody was Al Gore, you couldn't deal with global warming in this country by any means. And most of the great successes, as we've come to learn in counterterrorism of late, are successes like those of neutralizing the British plot, the toothpaste plot, I guess, by virtue of cooperation between the United States, Britain, Pakistan, et cetera, Afghanistan, it looks like as well. There are needs in this 21st century to have these kinds of relationships, and I think people were starting to look around and to wonder where help was going to come from, and it looked like there might be a fair amount out there for us. Interestingly, on the human rights front, or on the anti-genocide front, for those of you who are interested in Darfur, I'll try to mention it here and there, but Sudan, in the wake of the invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, was terrified that they were next. And of course, in the United States, there's a huge evangelical, and with the Bush administration, a very strong evangelical constituency. They were making their voices heard in Washington even prior to 9/11 with regard to Christians who were being killed in southern Sudan. Bush had appointed John Danforth, the former Missouri senator, as an envoy And there was a diplomatic process that was just getting underway. I think Danforth, if I have it right, was appointed actually on September 8th, 2011, believe it or not. But suddenly a peace process, you could argue it was all thanks to John Danforth, but I don't think there's evidence that it was just that. A peace process that had been truly stillborn basically for more than 20 years got a whole new life as Sudan began to feel like, oh, this isn't your mother's United States anymore. This is a United States that is prepared to go in search of foreign monsters to slay. And we, Khartoum, don't want to be that monster. And we see the influence that the Christian lobby is having on the president, and we see the cost of this civil war, and we see the potential perks of signing on to this peace deal. And so, literally, within a year and a half of 9/11, you had the first serious peace deal. It's actually a peace deal that's managing to stick between Khartoum and southern Sudan. But if you talk to any Sudanese, they will say that the stick, that was hanging over those negotiations was a threat of U.S. invasion and a true fear that after the United States was finished in Afghanistan, which then looked conceivable that might happen at some point, that Sudan was next on the target list, and that drove the negotiation process. All right, and we can say much more about both of these phases, but I'd like to now turn to Iraq's collateral damage and what I said I was going to talk about. First aspect, I think, of the collateral damage is in an area that many of you are familiar about, that we all think a lot about, and that is in the realm of power. In the 1990s and in the early part of the 21st century, the very early part, when people talked about power, they talked, of course, about what is now known as hard power, the U.S. GDP, just vanquishing those of even China and India combined, all of Europe, et cetera. The U.S. military budget, Pentagon budget being greater than the next 30 contenders combined. And then there are people like my former boss at the Kennedy School, Joe Nye, who introduced this notion of soft power. And soft power was our ability not just to coerce, but to convince, our ability to make others want what we wanted. And there was a lot of talk. I mean, soft power is a concept that circulated a lot in the 90s. How's our soft power doing? But it's still, we never really moved away from the construct of power and hard power being roughly synonyms, that ultimately your ability to influence, if power is in fact your ability to influence those you're intent on influencing, one way or the other, that hard power was the way that you would seek to see how you would stand. Well, in the wake of Iraq, I think it's essential that we recognize that if power is defined, as I think it should be, as influence, hard power remains, of course, an aspect of it. And on the hard power front, we're doing far less well than we were before the war in Iraq. Our military is totally overstretched. You have people on their third and fourth tours. Not to even mention the domestic dislocation those frequent cycles of reservists and National Guards people, the domestic disruption that all of that has caused, and I'm sure the financial disruption, although I haven't seen the measure of that. And of course the fiscal deficit and the deficit spending that we've done in order to pay for the war in Iraq. So even on the old, abacus of military might and economic strength, we are much more vulnerable as a result of the war in Iraq. But influence is the product of this hard power, and I think the product of two other variables. One is other people's perception that we are using our power properly, namely legitimacy. And thirdly, and I think this is crucial and not talked about enough, although I think we're all sort of feeling it, but maybe we're not naming it, other people's perception that we are competent in the use of our power. So hard power, legitimacy, and competence together, I think, tell you a lot about influence. And even though this talk is entitled Iraq's Collateral Damage, I could have said Iraq and Katrina's collateral damage in this regard, because actually being able to see into our society and to combine the bungling of Iraq with the bungling of Katrina creates a very different impression of what the United States is when it puts its mind to something, or what its capacities are. I think it's very fair to say that apart from our legitimacy problems, apart from torture and the war itself and all of those things, that we're no longer seen in the world as the country that put the man on the moon quite the same way. We're not the country that gave the world antiretrovirals or the country that liberated Europe from 2 world wars. Iraq and Katrina stand very, very prominently in the minds of our allies and of our potential foes. And I think the best measure, the best test of our influence is to actually just look around the globe today and look at our goals in foreign policy, whether you agree with them or don't agree with them. Look at our goals in North Korea. We'd prefer it if you didn't actually set off that nuclear weapon. Look at our goals in Iran. Kindly don't enrich. Our goals in Iraq. Kindly get it together. Sudan, would you stop committing genocide? Even something that one would think one might have been able to sort of conjure up support for, namely our position on UN reform, which you might argue that John Bolton is not the best vehicle for that position, but if you actually look at the contents of the Bush administration's reform proposals, they were closer than any other countries to those of Kofi Annan. And having the Bush administration on the side of those principles is probably one of the biggest blunders that Kofi Annan made in his tenure as Secretary General, which is saying something. And we just, if you look again at what our objectives are, the effect of Iraq on our ability to achieve those objectives is greatly diminished. So power is down. Secondly, just the strategic effects on the international stage of the war itself. Iraq has increased, of course, the presence of terrorists in Iraq to the degree that they were there. I don't think there's any evidence, of course, of a link with 9/11, but there was, it seems, a burgeoning al-Qaeda presence in northern Iraq. They now have the pick of the land. By taking our eye off the ball, of course, in Afghanistan, you could argue that we don't have the resources we need. Many of you who saw James Jones, the NATO commander, pleading for 2,500 troops, just 2,500 troops from the rest of our allies. We'll see just how desperate he is. And I believe that there were no takers, in fact, among the other countries who comprise NATO. So also, again, in that context, not just us taking our eye off the ball, but us in losing that summoning power, having a diminished ability to finish the job by actually relying on contributions from others. And I'll come to others. I mean, they deserve to be responsible in their own right for their neglect of the commons, but there's no question that Iraq has had an effect on our ability to summon. Thirdly, and really importantly, of course, the combination of the war in Afghanistan and that of Iraq eliminated, at least temporarily, Iran's 2 greatest enemies, the Taliban and Saddam Hussein, and freed it to become the hegemon of the region, which is not, again, in line with our interests at all. If you look at Iran and North Korea, you could also argue that by going to war under the rubric of pursuing a country with a weapons of mass destruction program, or if you look at the judgment to go to war in Iraq and not to go to war in North Korea, the lesson it seems that many countries have taken is that the only way to guard yourself off unilateral war by the United States, the only way to inoculate yourself is to actually have a nuclear weapon. And so I think part of what you're seeing in the proliferation that is going on now, and that does seem to even be nascent in countries that we never really thought were heading in that direction, has to do with some idea that if you're, look what the competing fortunes of Saddam Hussein and those of North Korea. And then finally, again, in a strategic sense, the rogues on the international stage, whether one is talking about rogues in the national security domain like Iran or those like Sudan, face far less of a threat of a U.S. reaction given the overstretch, financial and military, of manning 2 wars at once, 2 very, very challenging wars. A third collateral aspect of collateral damage, I am going to come to the sort of how we turn it around part, so before you all sink into the earth. There is of course, it's no secret that there's been a colossal concentration of power in the executive. This is something that there may be, the election certainly I think was a pushback and is somehow a healthy, I guess, corrective that democracies one of the few forms of government that kind of offer. But it will take an awful lot to undo much of what has been done. And of course, in the era of Al Jazeera, where every press conference that the president holds is broadcast simultaneously here to a domestic audience, but also live into Middle Eastern living rooms, this concentration of power, whether it's eavesdropping or our detention policies or the defense of the retreat from the Geneva Conventions, they have an effect in their own right in how we feel about our democracy, but they also have an effect because of the gap between what we're preaching abroad for others and then what is being espoused and indeed legislated at home. Fourth aspect, I don't have to say much about. We're more isolated, of course, than we have ever been before internationally. Fifth, and I think this is very important, and among progressives, I think it's very important that we think about it. There's been a taint of the language. I mentioned in the wake of 9/11 a new attention to democratization and some connection between liberty and security that you hadn't heard the Dick Cheneys and the Don Rumsfelds and the realists of the world be part of that discussion before. You still haven't heard much from them on those subjects, but nonetheless, much of what has been done in Iraq has been done under the rubric of democratization. And of course around the world, because now there is a correlation between the language of democracy and the act of regime change, military regime change, there is a serious tainting of language. Now, if it's only language, we're in good shape, and maybe that can be reversed very, very quickly. But I think if you look at some of the statements that have come out of lawyers and dissidents and independent voices in the Middle East, their desire not to be at all associated with the democracy agenda, to frame their efforts in very, very different languages, a great, great fear that anything that smacks of democracy is associated either with the barrel of the gun or with U.S. power more generally, or with elections where we support the elections until we get results that aren't to our liking. So there needs to be, and I'll come to this, but a reclaiming, a recalibrating of the norms, of the ideals that actually should probably over time be back at the center of not only our foreign policy, but that of democracies around the world. I mean, it is over time a more stabilizing ideology, even if one has to be much more careful about the very disruptive effect of democratization along the way. Sixth, and then I just have one more, and then we'll get to the turnaround. And this is very sad, but for me and for the Darfur students here, but there was this concept of humanitarian intervention. It was always a very dangerous concept because the idea that war and rescue could go together, or that helping people and bombing people could ever be compatible was always a bit of a stretch, perhaps. But as a concept, which is now enshrined in international law as the so-called responsibility to protect, which is basically the world's democracies have moved from the language of a right of intervention, which set off hackles in the developing world, to this idea of a responsibility to protect, which all the countries in the General Assembly agreed to in a resolution last September. And that concept is that governments have the first and foremost responsibility to protect their citizens. Citizens who are being butchered, especially, that responsibility vests first to the government. But if the state proves unable or unwilling to exercise that responsibility, it vests to the international community. That was the concept. Everyone can agree to the concept now. It is dead. The idea of countries enforcing that responsibility is, for the time being, and we can talk about what it would take to undo that, but if Vietnam gave us the Vietnam syndrome, which was vanquished, I guess you could say, by the first Gulf War, if Somalia gave us the Somalia syndrome, or what was called the Vietmalia syndrome in the mid-90s, and that was vanquished probably by the belated intervention in Bosnia and then by the Kosovo War, and the idea was, oh, we can actually do this. It doesn't always have to be 20 Rangers, dying on television and bodies being dragged to the streets. It doesn't always have to be Vietnam. The U.S. actually does have the competence and can acquire legitimacy through performing these kinds of acts. Now the Iraq syndrome will hang over all discussions, even once you get out of Iraq, about the use of power. And certainly I, in the Darfur context, would not even think about advocating a U.S. invasion of Sudan, even in order to help the victims of genocide in Darfur. I would argue that other countries could do that very, very usefully and should do that if the current stalemate continues and if Sudan executes what I fear is coming in the coming weeks. But the reality is that jihadis would follow American troops. And we all have to grapple with that. And so that movement I mentioned, which is now in full speed at campuses throughout the country, I mean, an incredible constituency to stop genocide. We now can bring the horse to water, but there's actually no water in the trough. We neither have, we are overstretched, but we also, I think, lack the legitimacy to go into a Muslim country in particular, even for a cause as important as stopping genocide. That doesn't mean we don't have diplomatic resources and clout to try to rally troops from other countries, and it doesn't absolve other countries from exercising the responsibility to protect that they have signed on to. But for right now, anyway, when it comes to American foreign policy, it will take, I think, many, many years to get back to where we were in advance of the war in Iraq in terms of the faith in American power and the possibility of using power to do good in the world. And the seventh and final point, and this isn't really, I sort of hesitated to include this, but it's not really collateral damage of Iraq, because I think this train was going, and Iraq has actually now just become an alibi for other democracies in the world. But the seventh point, and the seventh reality of life after Iraq, let me put it that way, is that nobody else is stepping up to the plate to tend to the commons, to answer the 911, to help the people of Darfur. I mean, countries that don't have issues with Islam in quite the way that we do, don't have issues with competence, who have performed well in consensual peacekeeping situations. You see no leadership of a meaningful kind. And part of that is that the muscle of self-reliance among middle powers especially has grown quite weak for lack of use over the last 60 years. Part of it is self-esteem, and literally, I mean, I was up in Canada talking to the foreign ministry about 10 days ago about these questions, and it just never dawns on Canadians that even when they have a rotating seat in the Security Council, that they should be the ones introducing resolutions and shepherding them through. But part of what I've just said is kind of crap. I mean, basically, it has to do also with their economic and their security interests, and the same cost-benefit calculuses that successive American presidents have made on issues like genocide prevention, civilian protection, nation building, shoring up failed states, democracy promotion. It's a fixed pie, and Democratic legislators and politicians are making judgments about where to spend their money, and often it's at home. It's where the voters are. So in this moment where the United States is overstretched and under-legitimated, there is a void, I think, on the international stage that is very, very disturbing, and that I think one has to tie to Iraq. In the realm of humanitarian intervention, of course, Iraq is also in domestic debates to the degree that there's a chance of building constituencies in other countries to do that kind of work, to help the people of Darfur or the next Rwanda or whatever. Iraq then becomes the stalking horse. It's not like people learn specific lessons of Iraq. It's just the image in every domestic debate about what happens when you go abroad to try to help people, even though that's, of course, not what motivated the war in the first place. So where do we go from here? There's no way that anything that I say will be commensurate to I think, with these deficits that have developed in just such a short time. I mean, a kind of almost miraculously short time. We're just now at the 3.5-year mark, or approaching the 3.5-year mark. 3.5 years since mission accomplished, and counting. But here would be what I would sort of suggest if I were advising President Obama in 2008 when he takes over in January 2009. The first is a return to realism, which is kind of not something you'd expect a human rights-minded person perhaps to say, but a different kind of realism than the old school realism, and I don't know where Leopold was on that, but I'd imagine he was something of a realist. But empiricism, I mean, to some degree, the old realism, which was very statist in its orientation, I don't think was sufficiently sensitive to the dynamics that went on inside states. And in a world where the gravest threats to our security, at least until Iran does get a nuclear weapon, are the threats posed by non-state actors, it's essential to be looking inside states. It's essential to be thinking in terms of legitimacy and the degree to which asymmetric threats are fostered by the backing of abusive regimes or undemocratic regimes. Now, there's certain cases, I mean, the old chestnuts of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, you know, where believing that you should look inside and believing that the way a regime treats its own people is a good predictor of the kind of long-term ally it can be, doesn't necessarily tell you what to do about Musharraf. I mean, it's not, but what it is a new empiricism that is looking at the effects. It's a consequentialism in the moment and in the medium term that looks at the effects that our relationships with undemocratic regimes have on our security, and that doesn't just assume that the enemy of our enemy is our friend and he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. It really looks inside societies. This new realism, this empiricism, also carries with it the commensurate obligation to look to international institutions, not for kumbaya reasons, and not simply because you believe international law is better, you know, as a constraint or as a backstop for state policy, but for pragmatic reasons, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because these threats are of such a nature that we simply can't do it alone. And what international institutions do at their best is they create, and international regimes do, is they create rules that chain people to the mast. Now, they're not going to chain many non-state actors to the mast, and that's a huge challenge with those institutions. But the relevant sort of target of opportunity, not in the military sense right now, is the curable part of anti-Americanism. It's the curable part. It's the okay, who hates us and who wants to kill us and who's cheering for who's killing us. That, you know, the who's killing us is much bigger than it was before the war in Iraq. The who's cheering those who are killing us is far bigger, and the who hates us, of course, is practically off the charts. There's plenty of that is simply the product of our power and of being, you know, the biggest kid on the block. But the relevant part, where however you measure those things, and the measurements are of course imperfect, but the only relevant part is the part that is curable. There will be some portion of it that will not be. And investing in these international institutions and in global cooperation will increase the tools we have at our disposal, because others will be with us, trying to contest what's coming at us and them. But also will be reducing the kind of support that these unsavory elements have. And I just will give you one example here. A few weeks ago, I heard the former head of MI6 speak, and this just really, I don't know if it'll hit a chord with you, but it really struck me. He was talking about, I think he's just retired a couple years ago, but he talked about trying to cultivate spies during the Cold War, basically behind the Iron Curtain. And he said people pretty much, I don't think he was exaggerating, but people fell over themselves to be a part of the enterprise of bringing down communism. And he said it's so different now. It's so hard for the British and the American intelligence networks to actually cultivate the kinds of agents inside these networks and inside these countries that we need in order to get the kind of intelligence we need to diffuse the threats. And I just think the contrast, and the Cold War was not a pretty picture in human rights grounds either, but it was in another league, I think, from some of the abuses that have gone on today. All right, so this sort of empirical realism, results orientation. Second, accountability. We you know, as Bush said after the last election, we have accountability in this country. It's called elections, and now, you know, we do have that. And I think more than just now the opportunity that Democrats have, well, to do just what has happened. I mean, basically to change the foreign policy team because the people have expressed a great skepticism about the conduct of foreign policy, but also the signal it sends internationally that we aren't going along. I mean, 2004 was a devastating election, not just for what it meant for the continued conduct of an ideological foreign policy and a seemingly one that really was in the faith-based universe and not in the reality-based universe, but it was an unbelievable signal to send internationally that we were endorsing some of what had been going on and much of what was being going on. I mean, no one reads the fine print. It doesn't look like 50-50 abroad. It looks like, as Bush himself said, major political capital to keep doing what you're doing. And so at a minimum, we can talk about what this election means for Democrats and what it means for Iraq and so on, but but this is at least a start. But one of the areas that I think we need accountability, and I can say it because I'm not a Democratic politician, and no Democratic politician, believe it or not, says this in public, but we actually need to talk about our torture policies and our detention policies. Hillary Clinton came out about 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and endorsed the president's position on coercive interrogation techniques, not McCain's position, distinguishing herself from McCain, perhaps with 2008 in mind. John Kerry did focus groups in the 2004 election. Bob Shrum did focus groups for John Kerry on whether he should mention Abu Ghraib in any one of the presidential debates. And the answer came back, no, it's not a winner politically, and so Abu Ghraib was never mentioned in any of the 3 political debates. You know, nothing has done, other than Iraq, nothing else has done the kind of harm to our standing abroad as Guantanamo, its existence as a whole, the torture then that has come as a result of these unaccountable sites, the black sites. Do you remember Dana Priest's big landmark Washington Post story? When Dana Priest's story ran about these sites that existed allegedly one in Eastern Europe, one in Afghanistan, Henry Hyde came out the very next day and called for an investigation of Dana Priest. And that is the kind of accountability we've had. It's who's leaking, how is this stuff getting out, rather than, oh my God, we have black sites. You know, we have sites that are being visited by no one, and we know what occurs in the darkness. We've learned what has occurred in unaccountable settings. So are the Democrats actually prepared not only to have accountability for Iraq? I mean, to cry over the spilt milk of Iraq probably needs to be done. I mean, we need to learn from it, et cetera. But there are things going on in the moment that are far easier to cure and have a profound effect on our security and certainly on our standing. Thirdly, and then just 2 more after that, this administration, anyway, basically, foreign policy regimes conduct foreign policy a la carte. You know, it's very hard to walk and chew gum at the same time. You have a discrete team of professionals. Of course, there's an overarching coordinating team. But the same people who came up with our position on the International Criminal Court were not the same people who came up with our position on the Geneva Conventions. The ICC people were the Clinton people beforehand, and then John Bolton made that his personal pursuit. It was a very different legal team who dealt with the Geneva Conventions and so on. It was certainly a very different group of individuals who were involved in actual torture in Iraq, and it looks like also in Bagram and in Guantanamo. But to the rest of the world, this a la cartism that is perhaps the nature of the beast doesn't look like a la cartism. It looks like we decided we didn't want to be a part of the International Criminal Court because we didn't want to be scrutinized by anybody else. We labeled the people we apprehended enemy combatants instead of prisoners of war because we didn't want to be liable to the genocide conventions. We set up offshore sites like that in Guantanamo so we could torture. I mean, it's the logical progression. If I didn't live in this country and know complicated foreign policy, that's, and when you combine it, of course, with there is some evidence that that many of the practices were, of course, top-down practices, but the entire scheme is seen as a piece, as a whole. Similarly, today, when the president endorses, or when Dick Cheney says that waterboarding is a no-brainer, on television, and of course that get picked up immediately all through Al Jazeera and every place else. In one breath, the Bush administration is endorsing waterboarding, and in the next, it's denouncing genocide in Darfur. It's beyond kind of Cold War hypocrisy and inconsistency. It makes the Darfur claims just sound truly absurd. It looks like something else just has to be going on. It can't be about genocide. There must be something else. It must be about oil. It must be about whacking another Arab regime. It has to be about something. So, consistency or foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of, small minds. But this degree of a la carte, you can't do certainly moral foreign policy a la carte, not in a globalized world where everything is being measured against everything else. Fourth, and then one more, the democracy promotion agenda, which has been so discredited, is basically an agenda around electocracy, not around a thicker form of democracy. And if there is a Democratic administration, it's really going to have to think through a much thicker concept. I think the concept is, it's a terrible phrase, it's a Canadian phrase too, so it'll never work with Bob Shrum, but it's human security, ultimately. It's, I mean, people, when you talk to people in repressive societies, and without essentializing, but the desire is to be able to feed your family and to be free of the jackboot in the human face, as Orwell used to say. And elections are very much expressive, for sure, as we think of them, but they are also means to throw the bastards out, like we have just done. They are means of getting a government in place where you're more likely to be able to feed your family, more likely to get antiretrovirals, more likely to not have to deal with the police as an abuser, or to not have to deal with corruption. These are enabling devices. And yet the way we have treated them is as if they are often both starting line and finish line. You know, we show up and then we're surprised when the parties that are, they happen to be radical as well, but they, I mean, what is Hamas if not the party that promises human security, you know, that offer the social services, and that, of course, by having armed elements in the society, you know, patrol neighborhoods and so on. Not endorsing voting for Hamas, but it is, I think, a reminder of how our attention spans need to be broader than just Election Day. In addition, in the wake of elections, while we view them as finish lines, never are citizens' expectations higher than in the wake, especially those who risk to vote, than in the wake of elections. And at just the moment that people feel like they've expressed themselves and the stakeholders are changing, and, you know, when stakeholders change, power dynamics change, people get desperate, violence is very, very likely. That's the time, of course, the media leaves. That's the time all our little election monitors scurry away. And really thinking, and this isn't something the United States can do alone, but thinking about a much thicker, much longer term approach, and one where we finally really turn the heat up, and not just us, but international officials who have more standing than we do, but on countries that have been freeloaders on the American security umbrella for quite a while, because they really are not showing up now as we are, as I said, in retreat. Fifth and final point, I don't know the politics of the people in the audience, I confess, but I'm sure I've offended everybody in some fashion. But there is I am a card-carrying progressive, and I was never a Democrat because I just didn't like anybody until Barack came along, but I voted Democrat for a long time. And one of the most disturbing sort of signs out there in the country, and it'll be interesting to see, you know, what becomes of it now that Democrats actually control both houses, but is that there is a progressive retreat, not dissimilar to what we saw in that pre-9/11 world. I mean, a sense of, whoa, if that's what we get by going abroad, whoa. So deep skepticism, certainly, about any kind of promotion of values in our foreign policy, and in my view, a corollary naivete, as if there's such thing as neutral dealings with countries abroad, as if you can somehow just not be for an abusive regime, but not, you know, kind of raise qualms about practices either. But I'll just close with a very disturbing poll. If you 42% of Americans as a whole right now believe that the United States should come home and just mind our own business. The second poll is that self-described liberals, and it's different, of course, than Democrats, and self-described conservatives were asked to rank a few months ago their top foreign policy priorities. And among self-described conservatives, the priorities were, number 1, defeat al-Qaeda, number 2, stop the spread of nuclear weapons, and number 3, capture bin Laden. Among self-described liberals, number 1 was get out of Iraq, number 2 was work with our allies, and number 3 was stop the spread of AIDS. Now, I'm a great believer in all three of those things, but I think it's very, very important that even the human rights people among us, just as Iraq has infected the capacity of U.S. power to be harnessed for good for a very long time, perhaps, we have to be very careful not to throw baby out with bathwater, and to tend also to America's security. And part of enhancing that security is going to be done by being a country whose values are actually reflected in our foreign policy. But it cuts both ways. We can't, just as you can't leave values out of foreign policy, or you end up to some degree in the mess that we're in, I believe. So too, of course, you can't leave security out of our foreign policy. And so I think one of the very sad consequences of the president not having an adult conversation in a very long time about foreign policy with the American people is that there is no constituency for a kind of middle course. And that's what President Obama, I think, will bring to the White House. Thank you. Questions? Thank you.
After a big drink of water, you will take some
Do you have any
questions.
Jack Daniels? I heard Arthur Schlesinger apparently requested Jack Daniels after his lecture. Water will do me fine.
Questions for our speaker? Yes, sir.
Since 1946, 50 million people have been murdered in genocide, as you know. No people have died in nuclear war since 1946. When you juxtapose these facts, is there a relationship? Has the human race made a Faustian bargain in which we pursued and expended our moral energies in the avoidance and prevention of mass death in the nuclear theater, and bankrupted our energies in the realm of genocide and sort of implicitly enabled genocide to succeed at the same time that nuclear peace has been maintained?
It's a great question. Did everybody hear the question? No. Okay. Just the question was that there's been obviously pronounced genocidal violence since 1950 and no use of a nuclear weapon since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Have we sort of focused all our energy on or made a Faustian bargain in preventing the spread of nuclear war? I hope I have it, or preventing the spread of, or preventing the use of nuclear weapons, and kind of bankrupted ourselves by allowing genocide to run amok? I mean, I guess I would say sort of correlative and not consequential necessarily. I mean, I don't exactly see the link, except insofar, I mean, it would have been entirely possible to maintain our nuclear posture for progressives to invest domestically in nuclear constraints and, you know, the disarmament movement and so on, and some of the checks that have been put in place and that were part of the Cold War negotiations. You could have imagined a world where you could have walked and chewed gum at the same time. But I think that I mean, I've literally never thought about this before. I think that the sort of structural piece of the last 50 years that is relevant, or that kind of overlaps with both, is this statism and this desire really not to meddle in the internal affairs of sovereign states. I mean, it's the cornerstone of the United Nations. It was meant to prevent the Hitlers of the world. Because remember, at Nuremberg, and somebody asked about this in the earlier session, or mentioned Nuremberg didn't prosecute genocide as such. It prosecuted the crime of aggression, crime against peace, it was known as. That was the sin in the international system. Damn you, you know, somebody's going to be somebody's Haile Selassie someday. Don't cross a border and invade another country. Now, I mean, the extermination of the Jews was prosecuted, but only the crimes that could be linked to the crime against peace. So with the Nuremberg jurisprudence, had Hitler confined his extermination to within German borders, none of those indictments, you know, would have been issued, and none of those men would have been executed. Maybe it would have been different. Maybe there would have been some punishment. But I mean, the member states were so aware of this, the genie of international law that they were letting out of the bottom. Member states, I say, the allies at the time, so aware of that, and so aware of the fear, the shudder it would send down through the spines of other states, that they were very careful to say, as long as you stay within your own borders, you know, we're not coming for you. You can do what you want. And that really has persisted to this day. I mean, when one looks at something that's also an existential threat, it was, and you know, some efforts to combat it, but it's still, you have a disappearing continent. But HIV/AIDS, Richard Holbrooke was the first person in the history of the UN Security Council to put AIDS on the agenda and say that it was actually a security issue. I mean, it was seen as a sort of soft, fluffy public health issue. Genocide as such was only put on the Security Council agenda because of, it's amazing, it's just like Nuremberg, because Serbia was invading a neighboring country because the international community had recognized Bosnia as an independent state before the genocide started. That's what precipitated the war. Normally it happens in the other direction. And remember, there was a big debate, was it just a Yugoslav civil war or was it a cross-border invasion? Well, it was because it was a cross-border invasion that the Security Council was able to speak to the matter. You know, the United Nations, I mean, you know, which again is meant to be the forum that we deal with the Commons. Well, the Commons is seen to be the guy who's invaded by the neighbor and not the tragedy of what goes on within states. And that's why this responsibility to protect that I've mentioned is so central. So, you know, I think those two trains could have run at once, but the nuclear, I mean, one of the successes of the non-proliferation regime and of the non-use regime was the return address, was the reciprocity point. And that's you know, this idea, and that's why it feels like a very different set of genies coming out of boxes now when you think about non-state actors getting a hold of these weapons, because no possibility of mutually assured destruction, and when you see suicide bombers willing to die, it totally screws with your theory, but that very reciprocity was a shield for genocidal regimes, because other states didn't want other people butting in, even if it was just on something like discrimination. They didn't want outside states, including this country, didn't want people looking at what was going on in the South, et cetera. So the same reciprocity, perhaps, and maybe this is the link as I think out loud, but the same reciprocity that has brought us relative stability in the nuclear sphere, although it always feels like it's one red button away, but you know, has actually shielded states from any kind of scrutiny on genocide until very, very recently.
Yes, and we have a microphone, so if you can just stand up and hold on a second, then everybody will be able to hear your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought the most effective way to hold the signers of R2P accountable was, both on an international level and as constituents of the United States government.
Could you just repeat the first part of the question again? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was wondering what the best way to hold the signers of R2P responsibility to protect accountable is, in your opinion?
Great. Now, so for those of you who aren't between the ages of 17 and 22, R2P probably still sounds like R2D2 or something, but from Star Wars. But R2P is this concept that I mentioned, the responsibility to protect, and among students and young people, I think it's really caught on, and I wish it were catching on in terms of enforcement. So the question is how to hold states accountable. I think it's very, very tricky. I mean, as I suggested, I think we live in a world now which is new in that people are willing to declare the responsibility to protect, but it's old in that no one's willing to exercise that responsibility. So the accountability comes in the same way that, you know, it has come in this country on Rwanda, in terms of, you know, my work and other people's work, where you actually excavate, you know, not merely, I'm always using sports analogies, but the box score, not merely that 800,000 people died and that we didn't do anything, but you literally open up and you dissect the pitch count and you see who was where and you name names. And I think, you know, Darfur is it's just a monstrous failure. So there's no success really that one can point to. But one does have to note what is different about the response to this campaign of slaughter and its predecessors. People in the Bush administration are really afraid that they're going to be known for where they were in relation to Darfur, even with North Korea and Iran and Iraq, et cetera. So the use of the word genocide was, you know, really quick, unprecedented in the history of the U.S. government, because the last thing they wanted to be known as is, you know, do you remember, long before your time, I'm sure you've seen it in the documentaries, but Christine Shelley, this hapless Pentagon spokesperson who was State Department or Pentagon? State Department spokesperson, who was wheeled out in 1994 in the middle of the Rwanda genocide and given these torturous instructions by the legal department to say it wasn't a genocide what was going on in Rwanda, even though they were killing, 1,000 people, every 20 minutes in the early part of the genocide or whatever. But she was wheeled out to say that it was just acts of genocide, and so she was just reading these tortures, and she goes on and on. She's wearing this terrible 1994 dress. It's like a monument to this moment, to the big 1994 hair, and And she just goes on and on. She keeps getting challenged by this Reuters reporter, and she just says, "No, no, Alan, you know, it's not a genocide. It's acts of genocide, and it just, you know, you need to show the intent to destroy." And I don't feel that the lawyers don't feel that that destruction has actually been shown, the national, ethnic, or religious group, and it's acts and not the deed of genocide. And so then this Reuters guy just erupts and says, "How many acts of genocide does it take to make a genocide?" You know, and she's, "I'm not going to answer that, Alan," or whatever. But it became this little snippet. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it is truly one of the most horrific. I mean, I feel sorry for this person because she was just, you know, handed these instructions. But the Bush administration, under no circumstances was there going to be a Christian. It is genocide. It must stop. You know, the denunciation. And instead of the use of the word, as you know, being a trigger, you know, for an opening of the toolbox and a roll up your sleeves, high level effort to figure out who can stop this, because it's not going to be certainly the United States that does it, or how a diplomatic coalition, how Sudan can be so isolated that it feels like it's in its interest to cease and desist. That use of the word genocide for about a year became a substitute for policy. So it was like the policy itself. So I think that naming names, disaggregating, you know, getting inside, getting journalists more, you know, enticed by this subject in countries besides the United States. I mean, I think, you know, reporters are now onto this in this country, that you should be held accountable for sins of omission as well as commission, and that just as, you know, the strategic consequences of ignoring Saddam Hussein's genocide against the Kurds in northern Iraq, or at least it's predictive, you know, I mean, it was very soon after they invaded Kuwait and so on, and but we remained aligned with him when he was gassing the Kurds, you know, that it's worth paying attention for strategic reasons. It's also worth paying attention for reputational reasons. But this kind of accountability, I mean, I can't even get My Problem from Hell published in Germany or in France. They're not interested. Now, I think in being mad at America that they would be very interested, but they're, you know, it's sort of like, duh, you know, of course we wouldn't do anything about genocide. It's not even, you know, it's not, I mean, Germany, I'm really surprised, but and no one has done anything kind of comparable where you take apart the government and really get inside and create that kind of accountability. And that's something hearings can do if you have an opposition party, but it requires some, you know, vocal minority being relentless and just not letting it go away. And President Clinton did a huge favor to that in this country by making that apology, because then it meant that no one in his administration, you know, could actually say it wasn't a mistake, you know, which they could have said. I mean, they could have said there was nothing we could have done, the Congress. And once he came out and said, it's the greatest regret of my presidency, which is, you know, again, saying something, it created a space so everybody became accessible. I mean, I probably would not have been able to write the book that I did if not for opening that up. But in middle powers, in democracies, because there's probably not that much point looking to non-democracies, but there's not this kind of conversation. There aren't people like you wearing green bracelets or talking about the responsibility to protect at a political level, at a grassroots level, and that's, I think, what has to happen in order to get that vertical accountability. Thank you for the question. That was excellent.
I find it intriguing that you suggest in 2008 Barack Obama would be our next president.
2009, January 2009.
2009.
Yeah.
But and he's charismatic and able to synthesize the ideas and get everyone motivated. But outside of that, what kind of methodology would you endorse for getting some type of consensus for a middle ground foreign policy, which looks at everything and synthesizes what we're doing in order to go forward, as opposed to just saying, hey, this is our guy, he's going to do it, he'll do it for us. How do you develop a framework or a context for a middle ground type of approach to foreign policy?
Well, I mean, having just sort of yammered on for too long, you know, I don't sort of, it was, I think a lot of it was in what I've tried to say. Maybe, so I'm just trying to think of like sort of what to add. I mean, there are two issues. One is what's the content of the foreign policy, and by no means was I suggesting that this knitted, non-a la carte, synthetic, perfectly consistent foreign policy was right around the corner and we just need to go and find it, name it, apply it. And I mean, you know, Pakistan is going to be treated differently, you know, than Serbia, you know, if Serbia is doing, I mean, nuclear states are going to be treated differently than non-nuclear states. But there's difference between saying, you know, it can't be perfectly consistent and acknowledging that, and accepting the kind of incredible cleavages that exist across the foreign policy spectrum now with the democracy rhetoric and so on, and then the overall conduct and the torture and so on the other. So let me just say a couple things just procedurally. I mean, the burden sharing point is incredibly important. I mean, I mentioned Clinton was multilateral if we can, unilateral if we must, Bush unilateral when we can, multilateral only when we absolutely must. We're coming to the point, I know this isn't fully true, but we're kind of all multilateralists now a little bit, like insofar as these threats, I think there is a dawning recognition, partly by performing badly, this badly, it almost had to be this badly in Iraq, and being so dependent on others in Afghanistan and now anywhere else there is conflict, the Iran enrichment talks, the North Korea talks. I mean, we just don't have a choice. And so, so going to international institutions, being willing to actually give things up, which is not something the United States has had to do for a long time. We've been able to get away with being the hyperpower and not giving anything up. Our sovereignty has been, you know, privileged above all else. We've gotten away for decades without signing any international human rights treaty or subjecting any of our, you know, domestic practices to those kinds of norms. And yet we would like to live in a world where those norms were observed in more places than not. So, you know, I think going into international institutions with a more solicitous tone, which it doesn't satisfy you because it's not substantive, but would make a huge amount of difference right off the bat. I do think, just to Obama for a second, having a Bahasa Indonesian-speaking, partial Swahili butchering speaking, I mean, he doesn't speak very good Swahili, but a little bit of Swahili here, as it happens, African-American, with a funny name that sounds like Osama, who was against the Iraq War. I mean, do not discount, just to buy you a little, I mean, we have so much damage to undo, you know, just I mean, as against, you know, a McCain or somebody who's associated with the Iraq War wants to send more troops and has, you know, stuck to that position, or Hillary who's endorsing waterboarding. I mean, you know, and it has other, you know, kind of connotations. I mean, I really think that is part of the battle. But what part of what I was suggesting, and this is something that hasn't been done in the history of American foreign policy, is, well, actually there's one counterexample, and that's the Marshall Plan. When the Marshall Plan was put forth, there was a recognition that the Republican Congress would never go along with it. Europe was a sinkhole, like the arguments you hear about Africa. Look at the interwar period and, you know, I mean, what's the point? And these people, they do this from time to time, as they used to say about Rwanda. What Atchison and others did, and Marshall, is they pulled together this sort of network of CEOs, of celebrities, of former government officials, and it was like this grassroots campaign where they took the Marshall Plan to the districts and made the case for the kind of commitment that was needed over time. And I think Obama, I mean, just partly through talking to him over the year, but I mean, I think understanding that none of these threats, again, are going to be able to be handled by the, you know, the old elites of Washington, the great men, the great wise men. I mean, how do you deal with energy independence, whether in the global warming sense or in the non-reliance on despotic regime sense, without the American people buy-in? You know, how do you deal with the kind of foreign aid commitments that are going to be required, or actually being willing to subject yourself to international legal regimes without having this conversation and making this case? So part of it, I mean, on the substance, again, a lot of what I said, I feel like, you know, at least spoke to that a little bit, and it's not soundbitey. But then part of it is procedurally going to the international institutions and making the case for pragmatic reasons, but in a much more systemic way nationally. I mean, this stuff has been settled in boardrooms for so long. I mean, apart from when you're in college and you get to have Leopold as your professor and you get to really engage these things, you're pretty much shut out of how foreign policy is made, and you are the recipient of those policies. And it used to be that you never really saw effects. I mean that's always been the structural problem with foreign policy, is that even if you do great harm, they're not voting, so there hasn't been much accountability. But increasingly we are, and with these domestic networks and the students and so on, those effects are coming home, and increasingly, of course, in a very dangerous way. The effects can come home if we aren't attentive, to who's coming after us. So I just think that thicker base involves centrism and pragmatism and empiricism, but it also, what I meant by that was actually getting out and actually, in a sense, buying yourself also some time and resources to reinvest in things that we've really neglected in pursuit of unilateralism and militarism and whatever it is that have natural lobbying constituencies, which is a different thing than what I'm talking about.
Perhaps one more question, and then we'll give our guest a break, and we'll move to a reception. Yes, microphone. Yeah, you're there.
I hear you saying that the way to turn around part of the reputation is to behave in ways that can build you a positive reputation. But even when we do that and the amnesia hits in and people start to forget things, we need a narrative that understands where we've been, especially since the 2004 election, and especially since the responsibility to protect people like Ignatieff, like Walzer, like Slaughter, came out pretty much in support of the Iraq War. So what is the narrative that you use, to understand where our country has been and to explain this episode once we start to behave differently?
I definitely appreciate your point about Slaughter and Ignatieff and others, and I'll just say a word about that and maybe stall long enough to come up with a narrative at this state of exhaustion. Michael, of course, was my colleague and is now about 2 weeks away from becoming head of the Liberal Party in Canada. This is Michael Ignatieff, who was the director of the Carr Center, and there were a number of people, a ridiculous number of people, including Peter Beinart and George Packer and other people whose writings I have respected over the years in different ways, and Michael, who believed that Iraq was the inexorable next place you... this is how tired I'm getting. Thank God it wasn't Jack Daniels. But believed that Iraq was the inexorable next place, that the inexorable kind of consequence of being regretful about Rwanda and believing that the war in East Timor or the war in Kosovo did more good than harm. And with Michael, just so you know, and with a lot of these people, Michael used to say, you can't make decisions about when and whether to go to war, because he and I were fighting a lot about we were arguing. In a very constructive way, actually. I think, unfortunately, I helped him make his argument better because in making the counter-argument, but anyway, he would say you can't make decisions about whether to go to war on the basis of the company you keep. And meaning, like, just because I'm getting, it sounds absurd now, I know, because of, it's really unfair in a way to talk about it because but I would say, but Michael, the company you keep are making the war. It matters who the company you keep. And I meant it not that I, in a million years, thought that Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, men of, collectively 83 years of experience in the U.S. government, in a million years, I couldn't have conceived that this war would have been done this way. But it did seem to me relevant that, it was not Michael's motive and the other people you've mentioned's motive it was a humanitarian intervention in their mind. But it was very clear to me that this was, 6th or 7th on the list of reasons that the war was being waged by this administration. And they were very explicit. As Wolfowitz would be the exception in the administration, who was, I think, really did think that there was a liberation strategy and it, was going to spread the domino theory of freedom throughout the Middle East. But really, that was a late-breaking rationale for the rest of the administration. Only when all the other items on the list, were not borne out by the experience of being in Iraq. And I mention all this because, apart from stalling, but it is very, very important what the motives are of any policy that lie behind any policy, or how an administration coalesces around a particular agenda, because it is predictive. If it's 7th on the list, if the Iraqi people are 7th on the list versus 1st, then you're going to park your tanks in front of the oil ministry and not in front of the hospital. It is truly predictive. That does not mean that this war executed well would have yielded, the results that this administration. it's so hard to know now, and it was so overdetermined, it seems, how badly it has gone and how badly it must have inevitably going to be going. But what was amazing to me, and maybe this gets to the narrative, is the degree to which it was best case planning rather than worst case planning. In humanitarian interventions, it's always worst case planning that is introduced in order to decide whether you do it, and that's one of the things that's undermined the exercise of the responsibility to protect. And you could say, after Iraq, well, maybe it's a healthy skepticism where you invoke the catastrophe in order to see if states are actually willing to put the resources required forward. But, I mean, the narrative that I would tell beyond what I've said today is just, I mean, it's basically already what I've said, is that the threats are real. Our tools to meet these threats need major modernization and revitalization. The transnational tools that are available, so the multilateral tools that are available to us, do not attract the best in any society. Instead of the UN being the place of first resort, you know, for a Northwestern, you know, graduate, you know, it's just not where people are going to send their best. Within the U.S. government, secondments don't occur, you know, you don't send your best. If you're an administration, you've got the pick of the litter. You're not going to send them into international institutions. They neither have the personnel, the political support domestically, nor the kind of modernized non-1945, you know, frameworks around non-state actors, around internal threats and genocide and so on. So, but in order for the United States to be a fixer and to be an enabler of burden sharing, it absolutely has to get its own house in order. And this is especially true in a globalized world where you can no longer make one argument for your domestic citizens, you know, and then another one internationally. The gaps between principle and practice, or between domestic, the values those of us who aren't of Middle Eastern descent, get to enjoy in this country versus those, you know, abroad, are transparent now. And when elements who see inside our society and see those gaps and those resentments foster, they now actually have the tools to make it very, very painful for us. So there are real costs to the values deficit in American foreign policy. And until we deal with that deficit, we're going to be much more vulnerable for a long time to come. So that's how I would make the case, some version of that. But Obama does it much better.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me invite you all to a reception next door, beginning immediately, and book signing right out here in the hall. And you probably want to take it.